Hello, my name is Ben Tarcson, and I'm the gallery manager at GCCA. Today I'm talking with exhibiting artist Jane Allen Nodine. Jane is currently displaying her painting series, Reflections, in our community gallery in the show called Looking Back and Forging Ahead, a COVID Retrospective. Welcome, Jane. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you, Ben, for putting this together. I'm glad to talk to you about my
I was
work.
wondering, could you tell me a little bit about your work in the Reflection series? How did this idea formulate throughout the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, Ben, my work has for many, many years been grounded in what I call materiality, where I'm very interested in materials and processes. The work, although I have not always worked abstractly, I have done a lot of work in abstraction. And I'd say for probably the past 15 years, it's been purely abstraction. Before that, I was doing a lot of figurative and sort of multi-image collage work, but now I'm doing pure abstract works. I use various materials. One is Tyvek, which is a commercial material used in building construction, but it's all used a lot in printing processes, and a lot of artists are using it now for even making sort of temporary garments and bags and things like that. But I like it because I can manipulate that material and get a textured surface. And texture is something that shows up in my work. Texture and pattern both have shown up in the work for many, many years. And I'm also a jewelry designer. And if you're familiar with any of that work, you know that pattern and texture show up heavily in that work. The way this reflection series developed was in 2020, when we realized that things were going to be shut down because of the pandemic. I looked at that time as a way to really enjoy, if you can say enjoy, what I would call an at-home artist in residence uh, event or activity. And my studio is in my home, which I'm fortunate for that, because I had a lot of friends who could not go to their studios because they were locked down. But I was able to develop a schedule where I was going every day into the studio and working. I did not start with any particular intention, other than the fact I knew I wanted to work on a series of paintings. In fact, I went in and I began working kind of like the artists who used automatism, where they were just sort of, that was kind of came out of surrealism, where they were not thinking specifically. It was also related to what some artists were doing in abstract expressionism. They were just letting their inner feelings or thoughts flow onto paper or canvas without any real judgment. And I did that for several weeks. In fact, I was developing work that I would step back and I would say, Jane, this is not you. I couldn't quite relate to what was going on. But I didn't stop doing it. And I told myself, don't judge what's happening, see where this goes. And after several weeks, I began to see some things developing on the surface that I was really pleased about in terms of the texture. And then I was using rich, very intense colors, which I had worked monochromatically for many years in my painting and printmaking. And so to come up with these very vibrant, exciting colors was very different. It was set aside from what I normally did. But the two together, the color and the texture, began speaking to me, and I began to see some things happening that I liked. I felt that I could reproduce, I could control those. And that's actually what happened. And that was probably, because we shut down in about March. I was working, and I would say it was maybe early May that I began to see these things happening that I was pleased with. And I worked from May very diligently on this series. Probably by the end of 2020, had about, maybe almost 40 pieces finished. In fact, I had several shows last year in North Carolina and of this series, and then I continued to work on it. And that's what I'm still working on now. I have a beautiful show there with the Greenville Creative Arts Center. And in fact, I've just recently accepted an invitation for these to be hosted in Spartanburg at the Coldwell Banker Kane Gallery, which is down on Morgan Square. And that will be from January until April. So I'm very pleased about that. Also, one of the pieces from the show was recently accepted in Cincinnati at the Manifest Gallery for one of their competitions called Euphoria, excuse me, Euphoria. And they just presented that show nationally, and it was very nice to be included with that.
In your art statement, you talk about this whole process of this art making in this series as a coping mechanism. Can you explain that a little bit more? Was it on the side of coping with being in quarantine, or was it coping with what was going on in the world, or is it coping with something that was going on internally?
It was really coping with all aspects of the pandemic, mainly having to stay at home, and then having to be very cautious about how we were dealing with interacting with other people. In fact, really for a while in the beginning, because I order most of my materials, early on in the pandemic, they thought that just touching something someone infected had touched could infect you. So when I would get packages in, I would actually leave them outside for at least 24 hours before I would get them and open them up. Now we know that that's not exactly the way the contagion is spread, and so it's not. But at the beginning, we didn't know the answers. Now, as far as being, I think, internally depressed or frightened, I really looked at the pandemic in a way as being. I mean, I was living a part of history, and I started looking at what other artists had done, because in art history, I've taught the plague, the bubonic plague, the Black Plague, and how artists had to isolate or went to the country. And of course, at that period of time, they just didn't have the knowledge of contagion that we do today. And of course, it affected the art, and a lot of people died in Europe because of that. But it's a situation I think it was a matter of keeping me busy and keeping me involved. And it was a way to be very active in the studio. And fortunately, something positive came out of it. But on the whole, like I said, I was reading and looking up things about other contagions and plagues pandemics that have affected the world, and found some of that really very interesting.
And kind of parallel to that point, why then do you think that it's important to make art and almost in a way look back while it's still happening on the events that have transpired, even though we're still in it? Why do you think that that's important as an active artist and you're still making art? Why is that so important to the history that we have and to our culture?
Well, it's a record. It's a record of what happened or what was happening. I think that whether my work will end up being beyond, let's say, our region. I know a lot of artists, writers, musicians, performers. There's going to be a lot that comes out of the pandemic, and we're going to see it. We're seeing some of it now, but it'll still be a few years down the road. We'll look back and we'll really see how things changed. One is we're doing the Zoom recording right now. A lot of performers found that they had to move to some sort of online or video programming. I just attended a jazz concert in Spartanburg this weekend, and I was very surprised at how low the turnout was. And the band was telling me that they've had a really hard time the past year encouraging people to come back. And that's something that, we've all gone through, and we're all kind of cautious about what we do in terms of groups. And, these things are going to affect us. I know I was reading something a while back about the Spanish flu pandemic in the early part of our century, 20th century, actually. And there were some aspects of architecture that changed because people used to be so closely, particularly in cities, they lived so close and so many people were in a small space. And some of that actually changed in terms of design. So, we'll see what's going to happen concerning this. We're seeing some now, but we'll see a lot more as we are able to look back.
Do you plan to move this series forward out, like if the pandemic ever does stop, or if we continue on into the pandemic? Do you see an end to the series of work that you're currently creating?
The way I've always worked, and I've always worked in series, is that once a series starts, I work through it and then I let it evolve. And usually there are things that happen as you're working. And I'm usually working on about 4 to 6 pieces at any given time, because people will ask me, say, oh, how long does it take to make a piece? And I said, that's not the way I work. I'm working on maybe 4, 6, or 8 pieces at once. I'll work on something until I reach a point. Maybe it's too wet to continue, or maybe I'm not sure where I want to go. And then I go and work on another piece. And often what happens then, that will give me insight as to what I need to go back and do on another piece. So I'm really kind of working back and forth on pieces. And then over a period of time, then individual pieces begin to become complete. And if I'm really close to completion, a lot of times I'll put it up in the studio. So I'm aware of it, but I don't want to push it over the edge. As you know, as an artist, that sometimes when you work too far, you can carry a piece too far, and then it's hard to bring it back. And so I'll kind of look at the piece, contemplate, let it be around me, and then at some point I make a final decision whether it needs more work or whether it's complete. But these will evolve. I can't say where they'll be going, but I'm still very actively involved in them. And I'm enjoying that and getting satisfaction. And like I said, I'm getting some exhibitions and getting exposure. And so as long as that's happening, I'm pleased.
Is when you were saying that you step back, is this something that the Tyvek, I guess we're going to get a little bit more into the process and technique more in detail here. Is that something where you have to be careful of, can you take off the Tyvek sheets, or is it something that you overlap existing sheets to cover them up?
Yes, it is. The base is kind of like a collage process at first, which has no color. And I used to work on panels, but I realized that the Tyvek adheres very well to canvas. So I'm using pre-stretched canvases now, which are lighter weight, which makes it a little easier. I actually manipulate the Tyvek to get the texture I'm wanting, and then I can begin to collage that to the surface. Once I get the texture adhered, and I'm using all acrylic materials with that, and then once I get it adhered to the surface, I can come back and begin to develop the color I want. And the color, I'm using a lot of different brands, but I do like the golden fluid acrylics very much, which are beautiful texture-wise and fluidity and viscosity. And also the intensity of the color I like very much. So I use a good bit of that. And some of that is poured, some of it is sprayed, some of it is painted. And then of course I'm letting layers dry. I come back in, I'm adding more, I'm taking away. So it's what I call kind of a push-pull situation, or addition, subtraction, if you want to look at it that way.
I think one of the last points that I maybe want to touch on is something that you describe in your artist statement, about this idea of overcoming the negativity and the positivity and these pools of color that you can probably see more specifically up in that upper left-hand corner there, as a way of drowning, as a metaphor of drowning out the negativity and looking forward into our future. Can you kind of touch on that idea?
Yes. What I was thinking about was, let's say if you look at the texture and think of it maybe just metaphorically, the way the virus is trying to take over. I was looking at the color as being this almost like the sea or the ocean washing in and beginning to fill those areas and take over. And because I've been using such seductive colors in these paintings, I feel like they give a very positive visual element. And I've had viewers tell me just how they really enjoy the richness and the aesthetic quality of the color and the texture, which I'm pleased about because, like I said, my previous work, a lot of it had been very monochromatic and was a little more, let's say, cerebral in a way. And not that these aren't cerebral, but I have really let myself be more free with the color, and I found that it's very enjoyable and very pleasant for the viewer.
Are there any last remarks that you wanted to make for the audience?
I've really enjoyed showing at the Creative Arts Center. You all have a lovely space. You've done just a beautiful job installing the show, and I recommend anyone to visit. Bring family and friends because it really is a nice facility. And I think you all are doing a really great service for the community, and I appreciate having the show. And I would also say, if anyone that visits the show or checks out the video, if you have any questions, you are free to contact me. Just go to my website. You can get my email address, or you can contact me through that. Anytime, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Awesome. And just as the last remark from me at GCCA, as a reminder, Jane's work will be on display through December 29th. So feel free to come by. We'll be open Tuesdays through Fridays, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. and then Saturdays, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Thank you.